As most of you know, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl introduced gender differences. Some species of Pokemon have differences in appearance based on their gender. These differences are a reference to sexual dimorphism, which is commonly seen in many real life forms and may offer some clues into their biology and behavior. Now, for the most part, these differences in appearances are pretty subtle. Actually, while making this video, I found out a lot more Pokemon have gender differences than I originally thought. But ever since the introduction of the mechanic in 2006, there's only been like 8 Pokemon that have gender differences moving forward. Now, if you're wondering what this has to do with anything, well, on July 24th of 2020, the source code for Pokemon Diamond and Pearl was leaked. That source code included an early build of the game, which included earlier designs of most Pokemon, as well as a previously scarce English demo version of the game. This leak gave us hundreds of sprites that we had no idea about, but the most interesting thing to come out of it was the idea that Game Freak may have planned to give almost every single Pokemon gender differences. To save some time, we're just going to get this out of the way. All of the differences you're going to see, for the most part, belong to the female of the species. The base design of the Pokemon was reserved for the males. This isn't the case for all of them, and I will point that out when we get to them. But without further ado, let's get started. Both Bulbasaur and Ivysaur had larger spots on their forehead. Charmeleon had a shorter spike on its head, and Charizard only had 1 horn instead of 2. I hate this, by the way. This one looks very wrong to me. Wartortle had smaller ears, while Blastoise had smaller cannons. Male Caterpies had a dark green tail, while female Caterpies had a tan tail. This was only visible on the back sprite. Weedles had a blunter head horn, and female Beedrills had a black thorax, which is actually a pretty cool one. Both Pidgey and Pidgeotto had smoother head feathers. If we look at Pidgeot, the males had wild head feathers compared to the female's more smoother design. Spearow and Fearow had shorter feathers on their head, if you could call whatever Fearow has on its head a feather. Now here's a big one. Female Pikachu have a heart-tipped tail. This made it into the actual game, but originally their ears were pointed downward. I don't know why. I don't like this one. Sandshrew had a shorter tail, while Sandslash had shorter claws. Both Clefairy and Clefable had bigger wings, which I think complements it a little bit more. For Vulpix, the tail was smaller, and for Ninetales, they had a shorter mane. Jigglypuff and Wigglytuff both had smaller ears. Meanwhile, Oddish had shorter leaves. Both Paris and Parasect had smaller claws, which is going to be a trend for the crab-like looking Pokemon. Venonat had shorter antennas. When it comes to Venomoth, the males had a longer middle spike on their head, and the females had longer side spikes on their head. I don't know what they are. Both Meowth and Persian had shorter whiskers, and female Psyducks had a heart-shaped tuft of hair on their head, which is adorable. They should bring this one back. Meanwhile, Golducks just had shorter head spikes. Mankey and Primeape had smaller ears, while Growlithe and Arcanine had a smoother head. Machop and Machoke had shorter ridges on their head, and this continued into Machamp as well. Pretty much the entirety of the Bellsprout family had smaller leaves for hands, while Tentacool and Tentacruel had larger frills. Rapidash had a shorter horn, and Slowpoke had a larger white section on its tail. Seal and Dugong had a smaller head horn. Shelder and Cloyster also had smaller spines on their shells. Onyx had a shorter horn, while Krabby and Kingler had smaller pincers. Executor had shorter leaves. Cubone and Marowak both had a smaller bone. Lickitung had a shorter tail, which, I don't know, I think it balances it out a little bit better. Coughing and Wheezing had smaller bumps. Horsea and Seadra had smaller fins. Mr. Mime had smaller ears. Electabuzz had a shorter head of hair, and Magmar has shorter back spines. Pinsir had shorter pincers, which this kind of goes against the whole design concept of this Pokemon, but that's fine. Lapras had a shorter head horn. When it comes to the Eevee boys, all 3 of them just had shorter ears. Amistar had a blunter shell, and Kabutops lacked 1 row of back spines that is present on the male Kabutops. The spike on the back of Aerodactyl was a lot shorter. Alright, this one's kind of weird. Female Snorlax just had its feet pointing inwards. I guess it doesn't need to man-spread. And to finish off Generation 1, female Dragonairs had a shorter head spine, as well as female Dragonites. And that's all for Generation 1. Let me know in the comments which of these gender differences you actually like or would like to see implemented into the actual game. And be sure to like and subscribe because we're going to be doing part 2 looking at all the Generation 2 Pokemon very soon. Until then, this is Nintendo Quest, and we'll see you next time.